I want to hit on the deficit reduction that was just before you and the joke of the comments, and I want you to clarify. Is it true that the fiscal year 21 deficit was 517 billion higher than where the Congressional Budget Office projected for the 2021 year?
The
Yes
right,
no?
our deficit, the deficit projection from last July to this one, yes, is higher.
So that's not a deficit reduction. And Biden's $2.78 trillion deficit in 2021 was the second highest in the history of America, driven in large part by his unpaid for $2 trillion American Rescue Plan. Is that correct?
Yes, the emergency spending during the pandemic, including the American Rescue Plan, drove the deficit last year. That is correct.
And so Biden's claimed fiscal year 22, a $1.5 trillion in deficit reduction is only because last year his inflationary $2 trillion ARP, American Rescue Plan, drove government spending to 30.5% of GDP, 10% higher than the historic average. His latest fiscal year 23 budget proposes annual deficits averaging 1.6 trillion a year. Director, in February 2021, your baseline showed 61 trillion in government spending over the next 10 years. You now say it will be 72 trillion, correct?
Yes, that is correct over the next 10 years.
Okay, so that's 11 trillion higher, correct?
Yep.
So in February 2021, your baseline showed just over 12 trillion in deficits over the next 10 years. You now say it will be close to 16 trillion in deficits, correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
Got it. So 3.5 trillion more in deficits. And in February 2021, you said the first interest rate hikes wouldn't come till 2024, correct?
In our economic projection, a year ago, that's correct.
Yes. Okay. Got it. Of course, now we have seen the Fed already increase rates twice in the last 6 months. And in February 2021, you said the government would spend 4.6 trillion on interest payments over the next 10 years. You now say it will be over 8 trillion, correct?
That is correct. It's both interest rates are higher and the amount of debt has gone up as well.
So based on every indicator we are looking at here, the administration is failing the American people. Your baseline projects inflation to be 4.7% this year, but inflation has already increased by almost 4% in 2022, making it highly likely we exceed 4.7%. To hit 4.7% inflation, we could not exceed 1% total for the remainder of the year. When were the GDP and inflation projections included in this baseline made?
So we locked our economic forecast at the very beginning of March. So the work was mainly done in February then. And as you said, inflation has turned out to be higher even immediately than we had forecast. And we see that especially in food prices and energy prices. I think all of us see that in gasoline prices. Some of that relates to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which we had the beginning of it, but the impact's been much more.
Yeah, Director, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, inflation was up 7.5%, correct?
Yes, inflation last year was up very sharply. Absolutely.
Yeah. So given that inflation continues to hover around a 40-year high, not to mention that inflation has gone up 11% since President Biden came into office, if you were writing this baseline today, knowing what you know now, how would that affect your projections and assumptions?
Okay, no, very good. As I said, so inflation in the first couple months of the year has turned out to be higher than we anticipated. It looks like the current quarter that we're in is coming in around our projections. The Fed has raised interest rates by more, and of course that's had an impact on financial markets. So it's just a sum of each, that inflation has been higher than we anticipated. The Fed's hiking, probably as a result, has been higher. And of course, we've seen the impact of that on financial markets. So
do you expect that 4.7% to be much lower than where we actually end up for the year?
We don't redo our forecast just because the way we do our.
Okay, so you're saying the rest of the year, we're going to be at 1% to match, to be able to get the 4.7.
To meet our forecast, which, as you think,
So,
there is a risk there. Absolutely.
So we're clearly, I'll tell you right now, if you all think we're going to be at 1% the rest of the year, I got some oceanfront property in Arizona to sell you, Director. Let me ask you about your economic growth objections. Your budget says the economy will grow at 3.1% this year. But given that the most recent GDP report actually showed a decline of 1.4%, knowing what you know now, how would the current dismal economic numbers affect your projections? Or are you sticking with it like you are the inflation numbers?
Okay. Again, just because the process we have, that once we have the baseline, that's locked down. So we're not going to, we don't redo our forecast. As you said, the first quarter had negative GDP growth. Some of that we see unwinding with, changes in inventories and trade. The outlook for the year is based on people coming back into the labor force. There's about 1 million people still on the sidelines who we see as coming back, and that's supporting, in part, the rebound that we see in the economics over the course of this year.
So, let's ask this: your future year inflation projections are relatively mild compared to where we are actually currently at with inflation, 8.3% in the most recent year-to-year CPI report, and 11% since Biden took office. But taking your projections for inflation, which assumes back to more normalized levels of 2% in a few years, what is the long-term damage to the U.S. budget and economic outlook of even the so-called short burst in inflation if it is actually short-lived?
So inflation has a number of effects on the economy and of course on the fiscal outlook. The key risk is interest rates. That high inflation leads to high interest rates, both through what the Fed is doing and through market reactions. And then as the debt level has gone up, higher interest rates translate into higher net interest outlays. And you see that in our projection over 10 years, net interest outlays as a share of GDP are more than doubling in our projection. So that is the fiscal risk of high inflation. It comes through high interest rates and high payments to service the U.S. debt.
Director, I'm a little concerned with some of the proposals you selected in your alternative fiscal assumptions modeling. For starters, a lot of them seem targeted at tax relief Republicans. When they want to continue to provide, which now has a proven track record of economic growth and historic revenue generation. In your alternative assumptions, you do incorporate, say things that the majority has been very clear that they do not view as temporary pandemic policies, and they want to continue, say things like the cost of continuing the student loan repayment moratorium indefinitely, canceling student loan debt altogether, a permanent extension of the child tax credit revision included in the American Rescue Plan that failed to include work requirements, and let's say a continuation of the increased Affordable Care Act subsidies that are set to expire.
Oh, okay. So no, thank you for the question. And I know that that this is extremely important to you, and we're continuing to work on some of these issues. Of course, we've done some work for you and for Senator Graham on these expiring provisions. We'll continue to do that. What we have in the report is chapter 5 in the report is the alternative scenarios. Essentially, we followed the practice in the past of looking at provisions such as the tax ones that you mentioned that have been in place for several years and continue. And the challenge for us was so much of the pandemic-related provisions where they were in the law for maybe a year and then expire. The child tax credits, as you mentioned, the expanded subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. We did not, of course, we didn't extend them in the baseline since they're not in current law. And then for the alternative provisions, we did not extend those either. again, because they're not in current law, they're not scheduled to expire in the future. It's analysis that we can do, of course, along with the JCT to answer the sorts of questions that I know you're very focused on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.